Thank you very much. And thank you for giving me this time and attention to talk to you about work and vocation, what we mean by those, and what it means to be a Christian conducting work, and what it means to have a vocation in the tradition of the Reformation. So before I get started, I want to just say that most of these thoughts are not my own thoughts. Obviously, I'm borrowing very, very heavily from Luther, from Calvin, a little bit from Kuyper, maybe less from Kuyper, quite a bit from a man named Gene Veith, who I would recommend if you want to read more on this subject. That's who you should read. And then from a historian of the church named Darrell Hart, who I grew up hearing about as a child, and some articles he wrote on work and how we are supposed to pursue work in the light of the Reformation specifically. And so that's really what I'm going to try and lay out today is what was the impact of the Reformation on work? Frequently when we think about the Reformation, we think about the five solas, the doctrines of grace as Dr. Bauckham has outlined for us. And we don't realize that one of the really massive impacts of the theology that the Reformers developed was a new way of thinking about work, about our lives as Christians here on earth. And so that's what I want to work on unpacking for us. The long and the short of this is that as the Reformers really reaffirmed the idea that God is the absolute creator and we are his creatures and everything is his creation, and that as they affirmed the idea of God's sovereignty, they started to think more carefully about how does that impact our everyday life. If God is the creator of everything, right, not just the material, if he's the creator of the heavens and of the earth, right, if he is the author of knowledge and the author of love, if that's who God is, and if he's reigning, right, he didn't just create it and walk away. If he's reigning over this supremely, how does that impact your life as you live it out? And so the Reformers ask themselves this question, does this impact work? And the answer is yes and yes. This impacts our work. Before we get started, I want to counter some common misconceptions and give us some definitions of what we mean by some terms that sometimes get interchanged with each other, and I want to just have some clarity. So I want to start with work itself. And the definition that I'm using, or I'm working from here, ironically, is this definition. This is activity involving mental or physical effort done in order to achieve a purpose or result. Right? So in English, words stick around long enough and they get multiple meanings. If you're in my chemistry class, at least one of you is in my chemistry class. I don't see the other, two. I don't see the third. We talk about the definition of work and we talk about kilojoules, right? And the amount of energy required for a given amount of work. But that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about human work, right? So work is something then that is conducted across all of the spheres we've been talking about, really across all of our lives, everything that we do, work is there, right? It's just effort that is mental or physical that we're engaging in. The next thing I want to talk about is a job, because job and work get conflated a lot. You might think that my work as a lecturer at ACU is to be a lecturer at ACU, right? My job is to be a lecturer at ACU in the sense that's my primary means of employment right now, but my work extends to every aspect of my life, right? My work extends to my relationship with my wife, to my relationship with my parents, to my relationship with my children, to my relationship with my neighbor, right? Work encompasses all of these things. So a job then is a paid position of regular employment, a task or a piece of work, especially one that is paid. And here in Zambia, we hear about piecework a lot, right? Everybody on the break, here in about a few weeks, right? Everybody's going to be, we're looking for piecework, right? That's the life of a student, is can we find some piecework when we have 2 weeks off, to earn a little extra kwacha, right? But really what we're talking about there is what I'm going to be calling a job. right? So something that involves that transaction of money. Two final ones. A career is another term I want to get some definition of, because career and vocation in the modern version of English sometimes get interchanged. And I think we need to really think about these as distinct terms from each other. A career is not necessarily a vocation. A career can be a vocation, but it is not necessarily a vocation. So a career is an occupation undertaken for a significant period of a person's life with opportunities for progress. That's the definition we're going to be looking for, right? So many of you, if, for instance, you're an agriculture student at ASU, you might be thinking, what is my future career, right? Am I going to be in government ministry, right? Am I going to be in working at a farm for my career, right? Are you going to be a soil scientist? Great career. I highly recommend it. It's very enjoyable. But what is your career going to be, right? And then lastly, I want to talk about vocation, right? Because this is sort of what comes out of the Reformation then, is this idea of a modified definition of a vocation. So there was, in the Roman Catholic Church at the time of the Reformation, there was a understanding of the word vocation, but it becomes modified and really expanded post the Reformation. So for you Latin scholars out there, which we better have some Latin scholars in this room, right? The word vocation is from to call, right? So it's this idea of something that you are called to. And so that's a really important distinction from what we might consider a secular position of career, right? So in Christianity, in post-Reformation, we see this as being called by God. So the most important distinction to recognize here is that a vocation requires at least two participants, right? It requires a caller, somebody who's calling, and a called person, right? Somebody who's being told, come, do this, right? And so that's a key difference. A career does not necessarily require that, right? And so I want to work on just thinking of those things and separating them out a bit. Okay. So the key things from this period on where we're talking about definitions, right? Job having to do with the exchange of money, work being in all spheres of our lives, right? Work in the home, work outside of the home, work for money, working not for money, working for charity, right? Giving people your time and diligently giving them your time so that you can be a blessing to them. These are all forms of work. Career, this lifelong thing that sometimes gets sort of mixed up with the idea of vocation, but I want us to see these as distinct, right? Next, I want us to consider the reasons for work, the purposes for work. Why do we work, right? In the language of Aristotle or Aquinas, this would be, and even really Calvin, this would be the teleology, right? What is the purpose of work? What is the goal, the ends of work? Where are we going with this work, right? And these are just sort of, I think, 4 general categories. You're very, very allowed to modify them. I just sort of organized it this way as I came up with the notes for this talk, but I think they serve some purpose, and you can probably even find them to some degree in somebody who I'm not a big fan of, but had some interesting ideas, Maslow, right? So there's the material ends of work, right? That work is to be done for survival, right? That's how we provide food for ourselves, right? That's how we provide clothing for ourselves, right? So this is one aspect of material. We can also see material as in material wealth, right? Not that we just provide for our needs, but you can actually expand that out to my wants. Maybe you want a Mercedes, right? Work can be the ends towards that. Maybe you want a nicer phone. Work can be the ends towards that. Those aren't needs. Those aren't things that are necessary for us to survive, even if we feel like they're necessary. These are things that are extra wants. So it can provide us with material needs. It can provide us with material wants, right? The other thing is, and this can maybe go under material wants, work can provide us with independence, right? material independence, right? If you have the ability to feed yourself, you are no longer dependent on the enzima at ACU, right? So that's a source of independence, right? Same goes with parents or anything, right? So work can be this source of independence and independent life, right? So those are the material reasons. The next ones I want to talk about are what you might call the personal, maybe even psychological. I haven't decided if that's a great way to talk about this, but personal for sure. We might be looking for fulfillment in our work, right? Something that makes you feel at the end of the day, that is good, that felt great, right? We might be looking for that in our work. We might be looking for the praise of men to build our reputation, right? We might be looking at the end of our day for people to say, wow, like look at Dr. Tim Wainway's work, right? That might be a motivation we have for our work, right? And I'm not passing value judgments on these right now. I'm just sort of listing them out, and then we'll realign them at the very end in sort of how the Reformation aligns these as far as values go. One of my favorite personal reasons for work is to keep us busy and keep us out of trouble, right? So I have a particular 4-year-old who many of you guys have met. If he is not busy, well, he will be busy. He will either be busy doing something constructive or destructive, right? So assigning work makes the situation more constructive. Not assigning work makes the situation more destructive, right? So that's another personal reason we might like to work, right? You might be like, when I'm idle, when I'm not doing anything, I get myself into trouble. So that's a real reason. Thirdly, we have societal reasons for work. So in societal reasons for work, right, is this idea that we're working for a purpose outside of ourselves, right? We're working for a purpose of the society, right? So in this instance, you might hear of something like, I'm contributing to the greater good, right? Right? My work isn't, maybe I have the material freedom where I don't need to work, right? I'm not working for personal satisfaction, but I want to be working for the social good, right? So an interesting example of this in modern times is somebody like Elon Musk, right? He's far beyond wants and needs as far as what money can buy him, right? He's far beyond those. But he works harder than almost anybody on the planet, probably, right? I don't know if you know this about him. He works extremely hard. So why does he work? The reasons for his work, at least as far as I can tell, are fulfillment, personal fulfillment, and also this idea that he can benefit the greater good, right? He can allow us to become multiplanetary, right? We can move off of Earth and move to Mars if he builds the rockets, right? That we can all drive electric vehicles, right? These are motivating him to work. So this is this sort of social motivation for work. So these are the three first ones: material, the personal, and the social. Once again, I'm not passing judgment until I get to this last one, which is the glory of God. So the fourth one, and just to speed run the conversation, right? This is where the Reformers are going to emphasize and spend their time. How do we do this, right? So what they're saying is to glorify God. That is a purpose of work, right? Now I want to point out something right now, and I'll make it more clear at the end. The Reformers were very much not saying that the other purposes were necessarily wrong or bad purposes, right? Insofar that any of those purposes might be free from sin, right? Those were not bad purposes, right? It's what do we align as the utmost value in our work? What is the uppermost purpose of your work, right? And hopefully that'll become more and more clear as we go. Okay, so now that we've considered definitions, we've considered the broad overarching purposes for work, I want to start considering a little more the history of the Reformation, the time and place the Reformation was existing in, and why they developed the specific sort of doctrines around vocation that they did. So for this, we really have to go at least back to Augustine, which is where I'll start. You can take the story back even further into church history, and you can even take it all the way back, to Adam in the garden if you want to take the story of work back that far, right? And you can take it back to actually God creating the world, right, which was considered work, which we'll do here in a minute. But I'm going to start the story of the Reformation with Augustine because I think he's the most important to have a grasp of, to understand eventually what the Reformers reacted against. Because in some very real ways, as much as we might love Augustine, the Reformation reacted against some things that Augustine actually laid out in his work here. So Augustine splits our lives into two, right? So there's the contemplative aspect of life, and there's the vivacious, active part of life. This active part of life is the part of life where we are engaged in the tasks of clothing ourselves, feeding ourselves, benefiting our neighbor, all these things. That's under what we would consider the active part of life. And then the contemplative part of life is what is the time in meditation, right? The time in prayer, the time in reading your scriptures. And for Augustine, he sees these things as almost as opposing forces on our time, right? To some degree. He's taken this one side and saying we should be looking for the leisure to engage in more contemplation. That should be our sort of our, even maybe our goal in work. And so that kind of starts the church off, or doesn't start it, but it's a good point to look at and say this is where the church starts or is thinking in this direction, right? So the focus is on the immaterial as being a superior use of time, right? The conceptual, the contemplative as being primarily more important than the active or the vivacious. And I want you to note, and I know many of you guys are in history of thought with me, so I specifically brought this up with you in mind, especially since you're sitting in paper in 2 weeks from me, right? So this won't be on the exam, but just, don't forget what we've learned in term 1 is my admonition here. You guys should realize that as you read that, you should see the Platonic influence there, right? That Plato is fundamentally separating out the world, right? He's saying there is the realm of the form and there is the realm of the material, right? And the form is more perfect than the material, right? So once again, for Plato, these were not abstractions that aren't real. They were realities. The forms were realities, right? And the nature of the fall, then for Plato, is when the form takes on the material, right? And that's what constitutes the fall in Plato's, I would say, anti-God worldview. And so Augustine is interacting with the ideas of Plato quite heavily. Remember, at one point in his early life, he is actually a Neoplatonist. He actually writes a chapter on how he's happy to be free from Neoplatonism, which is a great chapter to read in the Confessions if you ever have the time. But he still is carrying on some of the Greek traditions in that. This expands into the Middle Ages, this sort of dualistic perspective on the contemplative versus the vivacious expands into the monastic movement, right? And I know in the Protestant era, it's very easy for us to look at the monks and kind of look down on them, right? Taking these vows of celibacy, taking these vows to restrict their diet, taking their vows to never wear shiny clothes, right? Taking these vows to, support the poor in many ways. But I think really when you go back and you read the people founding those movements, you have to realize there was a very real sense in which these people were earnestly trying to say, how do we serve God best, right? There was a genuine question there. And if you're so far down the Protestant track that you think the whole monastic movement is just crazy, go back and read somebody like Francis Assisi and what he was dealing with in his life, giving up all of his wealth and saying, how do I serve God in this life, right? And I think there's some real power there. But the problem, I think, continued to be this dualism that existed in the church, right? Where the contemplative was sort of considered to be this higher ideal. And really the vivacious or the material work that we do was considered to be something of lower import, right? Something that was not as God-given, not as God-blessed. And so it was something that was not a true calling. So really what was happening at this time is there was only one calling, right? And the rest of work was sort of a necessity that had to be endured, right? So the calling was you could go into the clergy, right? You could become a monk, a priest, a nun, right? Take those vows and go off that direction. And that was one aspect. That was the way the church was using calling during that time, right? So it's much different than even the definition I gave of calling maybe at the start, but it does require, right, a called and a caller and a callee, I guess. Somebody who's coming, right, to the call. And so that's how vocation was restricted during that time. And so that's what the Reformers come into, right? So the Reformers come into this, and as they begin reconsidering the theology of the Catholic Church, right, at the base, who is God? How do we know God? What is knowledge of God, right? And this is what Luther and Calvin are dealing with. What's our relationship to God, right? How is our relationship to God established, right? They started to think about that, and they started to think about how does that impact your life? How does that impact the way you spend most of your time? And so there's two things I think we have to focus on here in Protestant theology that are really, really important, right? So this is emphasizing that distinction between God as the creator and everything else as the creature, right? Now, clearly, for those of you who read Aquinas at this point, Aquinas was arguing for God as the creator, right, of the material world for sure. Although it's a little bit less clear, I think, at least to me, where he thought things like natural reason came from, who is the author of that. And he's working from this side, and the Reformers, especially Calvin, are going to expand this creator-creature distinction and really focus on God as the creator of all things, right? Not just the material and the immaterial, but even I think the abstract, right? Of love, of joy, of goodness, of work, right? So now God becomes the creator of work, right? So work isn't this abstraction, right? It is this thing that existed maybe even before God, and that comes to us naturally. It's something that God creates, right? And that really changes the Protestant view on work. So the other one is this idea of lordship, right? So this is the idea of God's sovereignty over all things. And this is something also the Reformers begin to emphasize, right? Is that God is sovereign over all things. And right, to take the Kuyperian note on this, right, this is sovereignty over all spheres, right? So that's where Kuyper gets some of these ideas from. Not that they were formally played out in Calvin, but that's kind of one of the sources of Kuyper's ideas, or probably the main source really of Kuyper's ideas here. So the third thing they emphasize is that God is personal, right? So that while he is the creator, while he is the sovereign Lord, he is personal, right? He's individual here with you, right? Saving you individually, right? And so then it led to this question of, right, as an individual, as I work, how do I spend my time in work, right? If God is now the creator of work, if he's the sovereign Lord over all things, and if he is personal, right, interested in every aspect of my life, right? Every video I watch on TikTok, that's the really sobering one, right? Every short you watch on YouTube, or I forget what they call them, Reels on Instagram, right? These things, then how are we supposed to do those things, right? How are we supposed to do those things? So, God is the creator of work. I do want to point out here that the works of God get separated into two categories by the Reformers. They get separated into the work of creation, ex nihilo, God creating everything out of nothing, and they get broken down into the work of providence, which providence, and this is where you can read the catechism or the confessions in the back of your hymnal next chapel when you're getting ready. But I think the shorter catechism says something that this is the way that God preserves and governs all things, right? So that comes out of that idea of sovereignty. Very good. So inside this work of providence, then something the Reformers start to do is they start to be more explicit and say, look, one of the ways that God enacts his providence is actually through the work of men also, right? And men, I mean men and women here, humanity, right? That God's providence is actually worked out by us working, right? So God is the sustainer, right? Many people in the Reformed tradition will say, and this is a good thing to think about as you eat your lunch later, right? They'll say, it's God's providence that provided the enzima and the nkuku and whatever you guys are going to eat, right? But he used the hands of man, right? He used farmers, he used millers, he used fertilizer companies, he used a few chemists back in 1900 who you wouldn't even be able to grow the maize yields you have without them. Right, he used their work to provide enough food for Zambia. Right, I know it doesn't feel like there's enough food for Zambia, but we'd have far less without urea. Right, the guys that invented the urea fertilizer were doing work. Right, and that's God's providence. Then is the way the Reformers start to see it. And so this leads to the famous Kuyper saying that there is not one square inch of life over which God does not cry out, mine. Right, this belongs to the Lord. This also expands God's dominion over more than the moral law, more than simply worship, right? So it's not simply thou shalt not murder. It's not simply what was laid out in the Decalogue. It's not simply our salvation, our ceremonial act, whatever we're doing ceremonially, our sacraments, but it is all of life. Cool. And so that's kind of where we are on that. And so from that understanding of theology, you have to have a little bit of the understanding of where the theological break was, right? What do we think about God? Who is God? What is the knowledge of God? We have to understand that break a little bit. And now we can really start talking about work, because you thought this was going to be talking about work, and we are more focused on theology. So what Luther then starts to emphasize is that wherever you find yourself, the locus, right, the place you are in, that is the work God has specifically assigned to you. So for students, right, this means that as you write your papers, that is the work God has assigned to you, right? And I didn't write the Luther quote in here, but he says something like, in this, that becomes, doing your homework becomes, to the utmost of your ability and to the glory of God, becomes a holy act, right? This is something that really then comes out of the idea of the Reformation. So this is where they're going with this. And I want you to realize then, especially this broad definition of work, it wasn't just our work in the workplace, like I emphasized earlier. It wasn't just our job. It was our work in society, our work in the family, our work in the church, right? Across all spheres of our life. Our work in the university, seems like we're having a debate about where education goes, but our work in the university for those of us who are in the university, right? And so our vocation then becomes something that has to do with the place God has placed us providentially, and the abilities he's given us providentially, and how we use those things to his glory, right? So from this sort of broad concept that it's far more to do with sort of where we are sitting now, that we want to be thinking about our calling, right? What God has for us. Calvin gives us some really helpful guidelines just about living life in this world also. He sort of looks at the monastics and he says, look, God didn't just make food for sustenance, right? God made food to be delicious, and he made us to enjoy delicious food, right? This is something that Calvin says when he's dealing with this question of how do we live. And so there's this idea then that as you eat, you should eat delicious food when possible, right? And you should give glory to God in the eating of delicious food, right? And you can see how this affects the way you guys are going to cook here in Shima tonight, right? Perfectly, right? 5 finger, right? To perfection. Right? And so that's what Calvin says is, whatever purpose God assigned to something, that is what we should use it for, right? And so he really starts thinking about it in this way. What is the purpose of everything? And for work, he assigns 2 main purposes, and the primary purpose that we have hinted at is to love the Lord your God, right? To glorify God, right? And the second is to love your neighbor. So work is to be conducted to glorify God and to love your neighbor. And you can see we're getting at some of the purposes of work that we lined out earlier already. Right? And we can find this in Matthew, right, where Christ calls these the 2 greatest commandments. Right? What are the 2 greatest commandments, right? And these are the 2 greatest commandments. And that's where the Reformers then pull this from. Okay. So with this sort of theological background, with this idea around the idea of that work is occurring in this place that we are in, that it's supposed to be pointed towards the purpose of loving God, of loving our neighbor, I want us to think about practice, and then I'll gradually move more and more into, I think, what is practical for your lives. So while I want this to be interesting and inspiring intellectually, I'm very interested in us very carefully considering this for our lives especially as we go into reading week and into finals week and into break, right? Because the temptations to misuse of work will pile on you all through the next 4 weeks of your life, right? So I know many of you are not ACU students here, but I think most of you are ACU students, maybe the majority, and so I want you to consider it this way, right? So moving from the abstract to the more concrete, right? So what does this mean? The first thing that it means, and that the Reformers were very clear on, is that every Christian has a vocation. There is not such a thing in the Reformed view as a vocationless Christian, right? You have a call of God on your life wherever you are, right? And it's and that call where you are is to serve him in the place, in the moment you are in, right? Not to say he doesn't call us to move places sometimes or move jobs, but that and actually Luther and Calvin would differ on that a little bit. Luther would probably say, yeah, we're not supposed to really jump out of our positions too much, and Calvin would be a little more open to that, I think, crossing at least lines in as far as classes go, right? So that's the first thing, is you do have a vocation, right? So that's where you're a son, you're a brother, you're a churchgoer, you're a citizen of Zambia, right? You're a student at ACU. These are all callings on your life then that you are supposed to be living out, right? So how do we do this? I think Colossians here is probably one of the most helpful verses for understanding this, right? So in Colossians 3:22 and 24, bondservants, obey in everything those who are your earthly masters, not by way of eye service as people pleasers, but with sincerity of heart, fearing the Lord. Whatever you do, work heartily as for the Lord and not for men, knowing that from the Lord you will receive the inheritance as your reward. Right? That really what we are supposed to do is, what is one of the ways we actually please the Lord, right? It's very interesting, right? Obey in everything those who are your earthly masters in this instance, right? And so these are bondservants. These are people who are exchanging their time for maybe their freedom, or exchanging their time for money. I'm not super familiar on the ancient Roman economy, but one of the ways that they do serve the Lord is actually by pleasing those who have employed them, right? Which is a sort of idea that the Reformers double down on, right? That it is the work of your hands and how it is seen by those who are evaluating it, right? Does give glory to God. So, right, and I want to point out here, Paul isn't discussing the contemplative life here, right? He's discussing the working life, the life that provides for us. with our hands or with our minds or whatever God has given us. So that's where Paul is working from in that passage. So Luther has the most probably famous practical example of this. I know some of you who have sat in my class have heard this already, but a shoemaker wrote him, right, and said, what should I do? I've just become a Christian. And he said something like this. This story may be true, it may be false, but either way, it gets the point, and it's something I'm sure Luther would have agreed with. He says, the Christian shoemaker does his duty not by putting little crosses on the shoes, but by making good shoes, because God is interested in good craftsmanship, right? So one of the things I think we can really practically think about as you and as a Christian university is slapping the cross on your diploma does not make it a Christian diploma, right? Giving a quality education that honors God and that loves your neighbor makes it a Christian diploma, right? And then obviously the paper isn't Christian, but that gives you that is what the Christian education is supposed to be, right? So that's what we should be aiming for. And I know sometimes it's like, this is what the faculty should be aiming for. No, this is what the students and the faculty and the whole community, it should be from the people working at the gate to the people funding the university who don't even set foot on it. This ought to be what we're trying to do, right? We're not trying to slap a cross on something that's not of good quality, right? So I think that's really important for us to consider. So right in this, I think Dr. Killian talked yesterday. I didn't go to Dr. Killian's talk. I went to the Dr. Mbewe's talk, but right, he talked about excellence, right? And so this is something that we should be aiming for, right? So as you guys prepare for your exams, right, you should be trying to get good marks, right? That is a worthy goal. But the ultimate goal is not the marks, right? The ultimate goal is not the person who's going to mark it, right? You please God when you do a good job at the work, but the ultimate goal is to please the Lord in your work. So as you write your history of thought paper next Wednesday, right? Yes, you should be writing the answers you think that I want to read, right? You should be trying to write the right answers, but your final end in that should be to glorify God, right? And one of the ways you glorify God is by writing a great paper, right? Using great English for Mr. Tembo, right? And really carefully considering the material and knowing the material, right? There's a tension that exists here then that we find in just practical human life, right? So I want us to realize that in all of this, God commands us to meditate on his law, right? He commands us to read his word, to a life of prayer, and he also commands us to rest, right? God, when he created work, he worked for 6 days, and then he rested, right? Rest isn't an invention of man's, right? We can create it into an idol because we can make anything into an idol. We can make work into an idol. We can make a university paper into an idol. We can make a friendship into an idol, right? We can make an idol out of rest, out of leisure, right? But really, God created rest, and he expects us to rest, right? So tomorrow is Sunday, right? That's traditionally in the church the day that is set apart for rest, right? I won't out anybody here, but I have had students text me on a Sunday about homework assignments. That is a fool's errand. You will never hear back from me on Sunday unless you're like, my arm is cut off. Can you come to the hospital and sew it back on? And I will come then and help you sew your arm back on, right? But that is the day that I have for rest. I know there's debate about that. I think we even have Seventh-day Adventists, right? But just to point out that God commands this to be rest, right? And that work can become this idol. So what I want you to think about here is in whatever you do, right? If you wrote a good exam, then to God be the glory, right? If you wrote a bad exam, but you really put your effort into it, to God be the glory, right? If ACU football team beats people 9-0, to God be the glory. If the reverse happens, which is far more probable, to God be the glory, and let's work harder, guys. Right? if you grow a beautiful field of maize and you yield a lot of mealy meal off that, to God be the glory for that, right? So I want us to think in that way as we go about our employments. Then I want us to briefly, and before I have a final little exhortation here, I want to briefly consider the purposes of work that we talked about at the very start. So the material, the personal, the social purposes for work. And I just want to point out that we have to reverse the order, right? We have to say first, why is our primary reason for doing this? To the glory of God. And then second, what's our second reason, right? Out of love for our neighbor, right? That is sort of what the Reformed tradition on work comes to, and I think is also the biblical truth here, right? And then the material well-being, right? And one of those passages that you read through and you're like, ouch, when Paul reads it, right, is in Thessalonians, right? If anyone will not work, he shall not eat, right? If you're not working, you shouldn't be eating, right? Is what Paul says. And I encourage you, and myself included on this, right? When we struggle with idleness, when we struggle with laziness, right? Go read the Proverbs, right? The lazy man is the brother to a great destroyer, right? Paul, somewhere else in the same passage in Thessalonians, I didn't write it down, I think he says, have nothing to do with that man, right? The one who doesn't work. So work isn't, in this instance, saving us, obviously, right? That is not what we are arguing for. We are talking about the freedom to work, having experienced the grace of God. Finally, I want to talk about personal fulfillment. And this is one I think Christians can really shy away from, but I think it is a true blessing that comes from aligning our work and our reasons for work correctly. God gives you desires, he gives you abilities, he gives you strengths and weaknesses, right? And from those, I think when we glorify God with those, when we benefit our neighbor with those, when we provide materially for ourselves and others with those, that is fulfilling. I think that is part of the way that God made man and woman, is that this work actually does feel fulfilling, right? It should not be the primary end, because I think, and Anselm, I was having a little bit of trouble with my Kindle before coming up here, but I wanted to write the Anselm quote on this down, but right, Anselm finishes his sort of argument for God with for the existence of God with these last thoughts. He says, right, if you want wisdom, then know and love the creator of wisdom. If you want friendship, know and love the creator of friendship, right? If you want peace, love and know the creator of peace, right? If you want wealth, right? If you want to be free from hunger, know and love the creator of these things. And that's another, I know I'm throwing out, read this. That's another one I would really encourage you to read, even if you don't read the rest of Anselm's work, is to read that really powerful chapter where he's putting forward a logical argument for God, and it ends in this prayerful devotion and love towards God. And it's really powerful. Okay. So that's the main things. This one final, I think we've covered this, but I just to bring the point home, I want to give you this final exhortation. So from the Reformation teaching on vocation, right, I think there's 4 main ways we can go about work, 3 of which are wrong and that we need to repent of and turn from, and then the one which I've just outlined, which is the correct and God-honoring one. So the first and most obvious is that we are not to be slothful, lazy, or idle, right? This is warned against on all accounts. This is warned against in the non-Christian traditions of the Greeks and the Romans, and the non-Christian traditions all over the world, right? Idleness is not something that is to be praised. This is, and I gave the examples of ACU students here, how this could be embodied, and I'm not trying to call individuals out. I'm trying to have us all think about this. You can apply these things as easily to me as to you. This is a student who is too busy, watching football, folding their hands, being consumed by slothfulness, TikTok, whatever it is, to pass their papers, and fails their papers, not having worked hard, but having been lazy. And in this does not bring glory to God in their work, right? So that's the first one. The second one is that of asceticism, or the monastic approach, right? Where we start treating God's good gifts for us as simply a moral hazard. Yes, these are all things that we can create idols out of, right? Delicious food can become an idol. Friendship can become an idol. All of these things are things we can make idolatry out of. Hard work can become an idol, right? And it's a really tricky idol, and it can look quite good. But in this particular form of idolatry, what we do is we set aside all work that is not completely contemplative, right? So for instance, a story I know of, a true story is a mother who neglected to feed and clothe her children because she was too busy always in her room praying, right? That is not honoring to God, right? You've abdicated your responsibility as a mother. You've left your vocation of motherhood, right? And you have, in fact, actually really probably turned that child away from the Lord, right? You are not extending God's love through your life to them. So we need to consider that one carefully, right? So this is a student in our student example who is too holy for homework, right? You're too sacred for the homework that gets applied to you. So this student becomes consumed with contemplation, so much so that they fail their papers, and even worse, now can be tempted towards cheating to pass their papers, right? You may even open yourself up to committing another type of sin, right? Doing all of this while you're sounding super, super holy, right? So you get to sound super holy, but in fact, you're doing something that I would say is fundamentally unchristian, right? So that's something we need to look out for as academics, as students, as teachers. The third I hinted to a second ago is workaholism, ambition, and fleshly desires that drive our work, right? This gets at the purpose of work. For what reason do we work, right? This is working for the accolades of man, because we want men to look at us and say, wow, look at that hard worker, right? This is working because we want that Mercedes-Benz more than we want anything. Not that a Mercedes can't be a great blessing from God, but that becomes our end, right? and this is what we're talking about here. So in the life of the student, this is in fact deceitful self-worship is what you're doing. You're working for the praise of man, for wealth, right? You're more interested in the job you will get after university from the papers you get at university than glorifying God in your university now. One of the easy manifestations I see of this in conversations with ACU students and in my own heart, so I'm not just pointing you guys out, is that we can very easily start to think, well, I don't have to worry about honoring God in my education in the way I write my papers, because when I'm done, I'll have a job that allows me to honor God, right? Right. So same thing can happen with tithing, right? Right. I only have 10 kwacha. When I have 100,000 kwacha, then I'll give, right? But God doesn't ask us what we're going to do when we get the 100,000 kwacha, right? That's not what He's asking, right? So this one then is that we become absorbed with maybe even the reputation of work, what work can give us in the flesh, maybe even what work can give us socially, and that becomes the end. So my example here is an agriculture student, right? Not anybody particular, but I'm just saying an example here. An agriculture student at ACU, where you are so focused on getting the marks, right, that you do genuinely neglect your devotions and your studies to God's word and your time in prayer, right? You think that's for the theology students because they have the calling to the ministry, right? And you have the calling to agriculture. And we don't really have an excuse for that. Another Luther saying on this, right, is he said, if I've woken up and I have an extremely busy day, the busiest day maybe I've ever had, then that means I need to spend 3 hours in prayer, right? That was his thinking on how to handle the overwhelming load of work, because for him, the prayer was a necessary precursor to his work, right? And that's a challenging one, right? and we should consider it. So the last one, right, is what I pointed out, and this is the one I want to close on. Then it looks like I'll be a little early. Is this worshipful work and obedience in all modes of life, right? This is a student who, regardless of their God-given abilities, strives with all their might in the tasks God has set before them, right? God didn't give us all the same brain, right? One of the most difficult things to experience as a professor is that you meet students who work hard, who love to learn, but for whatever reason, and no matter what method of teaching you try, they cannot progress as fast as some student who is doing none of the homework, who's doing none of the reading, but is very, 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 very smart. And we can't change some of these things that God gives us, right? God gives us what we have in that regard. He gives us our mind. We steward our mind. God gives us the raw materials we work with, right? So that's what we need to consider there. So this is that student, right? This is a student, regardless of your abilities, whether you are putting in your best efforts and getting an F, or putting in your best efforts and getting an A, right? This student isn't relying on their own strength, but is humbly relying on the strength of God, turning to Him in prayer while being diligent, right? When they are weak and discouraged and stray from the path, they turn to the Lord. This is a student that when they have finished their paper, whether they pass with an A or whether they fail, they turn and say with confidence and joy, to God be the glory for the work that was done here, right? So this student isn't, the grade is important, right? They're aiming for that. They're working towards that. But they know at the end of the day that to God be the glory for the work that was done here. And that is I think the last thing I want to leave you with is that model, that image that I think we at ACU, all of us should be seeking to implement in our lives, right? Is that we do work hard, right? We do persevere. We need that time in prayer, in reading God's word. And then whatever we are given at the end of the day, we say thanks be to God for that and glory to be God. So that's what I've got. 11:56, Tisa?